All right, so we're going to do another video on MCO, margin coverage option. This is a new product as of last year, 2026. We're going to talk about it in regards to the 27 crop. So not this harvest coming up, but actually next year's crop. The sign-up deadline for it is September 30th of this year. So it's a pretty extended window, but we'll get into that. We're going to go over just an overview of it, the calculations behind it, historical performance of this product and similar margin products, and then just kind of a pros and cons trade-off kind of thing that we want to look at. So I'm going to start with the pros and cons actually, and then we'll come back to it at the end. But if you don't watch the entire rest of the video, if you only have 3 minutes to watch this, I'll give you the kind of the quick and dirty of why we're talking about MCO, the advantages and the disadvantages. So the overall overarching goal of margin coverage option, just like margin protection, is to help protect against a rise in inputs. So instead of it just being price and yield as your triggers, we now have inputs, so some fertilizer and some fuel values that could potentially trigger a payment one way or another. The other difference is that there's an earlier price discovery. And so the price discovery for the corn value is August 15th to September 14th of this year for next year's crop. And so in some years, that value earlier on is higher than what we see in the springtime. So that could be an advantage or a disadvantage. The overall cons of the product, it's a September 30th sign up. So we've got to be committed to an AIP, to an approved insurance provider by September 30th. So if you're somebody that takes hail and wind insurance or private products, like we wrote a lot of the bands this year, we have no idea what these companies are offering or what their hail rates look like for next year. So we'd have to, in order to take MCO, we'd have to commit to an AIP before we know any of those variables. The other side of it, just like I talked about the inputs and helping protect against a rise in inputs, is it can actually work against you if inputs come down. So overall, big picture, if we like that price, that fall discovery price that we're coming up on here in the middle of August, it could have some merit if we wanted to expand our price discovery a little bit and hedge some of the input risk. So I'll get into some of the details of that here, but overall, that's the 2-minute elevator pitch. Should I take MCO, or is it right for me, or is it not? So what is MCO? When I say MCO, I want you to think of it as kind of like a cousin to ECO. So MCO stands for margin coverage option, and it covers that top 95% band just like ECO did last year. So ECO is up on this top 95 down to 90, and then SCO kicks in below that and goes down to wherever your multi-peril leaves off. ECO is that same band up on the very top. You cannot take ECO and MCO together. You've got to take one or the two. So if you elected MCO here in September 30th, then that kicks you out of being eligible for ECO later in the year. Now you still can take SCO, that's that bottom band, and then of course you're still going to be taking your 75% revenue protection. The inputs that are included on it, I've got those outlined here on the side. You've got diesel, DAP, urea, and potash. And then if you've got irrigated corn, that qualifies for natural gas as well. They use natural gas as kind of their proxy for irrigation expense. We've had some questions of, I've heard of margin protection. Is this the same thing? The short answer is no. They function similarly in that they're going to pay out if inputs go up or if prices come down. But margin protection it's a very different animal. Margin protection is here on the left. It's an area-based plan that is 95 all the way down. So instead of it just being a little top band over here, it's got coverage from 95 all the way down. Now there's some premium offsets and there's some indemnity offsets. So it's not like you're doubling up your insurance coverage, but you effectively have a much larger band of protection with that older margin protection product. This new margin coverage option only goes from 95 down to 90. Now this is for 2027. I'll get into that in a second. You're probably used to hearing us talk about 95 down to 86. But to focus on this slide for a second, the margin coverage option only covers that top band. Then it sits on top of your SCO, which sits on top of your revenue protection. So two different concepts here. You've got the margin protection, which is a much larger band of coverage, whereas MCO is just that top 5%. Now for 2026, for this crop year, if you took margin coverage option or ECO, enhanced coverage option for that matter, you were taking a 9% band of a product, 95 down to 86. Then SCO kicks in at 86 and goes down to your multi-peril. So in this example, I just had 75% multi-peril. We put 86 down to 75 would be an 11% band. Ask me why, but for 2027, they're changing it so that SCO now goes up to 90, and then ECO or MCO goes up to 95. So ECO or MCO is only going to be a 5% band this year. 5% band. You're talking $50 to $60 of coverage per acre. Okay. SCO is now going to be a 15% band if you took that same 75% multi-peril. So SCO is becoming larger. Let's get into this calendar to understand the pricing windows. So this is kind of like where we're sitting today, August. I'm recording this on August 5th. So if I had my line in the sand, this is where we'd be at today. The corn price for, and soybeans, for this MCO for 2027 is going to start on August 15th, and it's going to go through September 14th. So we are almost a full, well, over a full calendar year away from harvest of 2027. The visuals here, what I tried to outline here is this gray is like our typical regular old multi-peril crop insurance window. We sign up in February, March, we get through the growing season, we have harvest here in Sept, October, and then you've got your claims paid out and finalized, usually by the end of the year or close to it, depending on, if you had when your claims got worked. SCO and ECO, as we saw from last year, from 2025, those claims didn't get paid out until the final county yields were published in the following June. So we've got a whole 6 months of time over that, 6 or 7 or 8 months between harvest and when that claim actually gets paid out if the county had a yield loss or a price decline. Margin coverage option is this even bigger window. So we're reaching back all the way into this, here coming up in about 10 days is going to be the start of that discovery window. We've got to sign up, if we want to, we've got to sign up for that product here in September, at the end of September. Then we're going to get to planting, and we're going to get to harvest, and then it's going to be June of 2028 before we know if this product created a payment, because we've got to wait for those final county yields, just like SCO, ECO, or any other area-based plan. So it's a much larger window. It's a much larger amount of time between the decision point and the actual outcome. But just keep in mind, you're not going to be paying your premium early. It's not anything like that. You're still going to be paying your premium here in August, September of when your regular multi-peril is due. But just so you have an idea of the window that we're looking at. The window, the price discovery for corn and beans is happening during this August 15th to September 14th window. The other prices that are being discovered is our fertilizer values. So we talked about the diesel, DAP, urea, and natural gas. Those are all values that are traded on the CME, and you can go and look them up. If you just typed in CME urea into your Google, this is going to be the first thing that comes up. You can see the CME urea values, the diesel values. Of course, we know we can trade energies. These fertilizer contracts are a little bit less known, and there's not a lot of liquidity or volume on them, and so we can't really trade them effectively with our brokerage accounts today, but hopefully that's something we can work on in the future. But that's how they're discovering these values. So back to the calendar, here in August and September, they're looking out and saying, okay, May of 2027, what is diesel trading? May of 2027, what is urea and DAP? What are those values trading? That's how they're going to decide, okay, what's our expected margin? Once they've discovered those values here in the fall, we get to April, we get to the planting time frame, and now we've got the actual values. So what is diesel in April of 2027? What is urea in April of 2027? That's how they're going to determine, did those inputs go up or did they go down? Then we get to harvest, and that's when we decide what was the corn or soybean price. That month of October is when they decide what's the final price for the 27 year. And then the county yields, of course, we are harvesting the county yields in October, but they don't finalize all that data until June. So there's kind of your timeline of how those values get assigned or realized. So based on that time frame, kind of leads me into this historical analysis chart. So what I have here is margin protection, MP, performance over time. It's not MCO because there's not historical data. It's only been around for 1 year, right? So what I'm doing here is looking back at margin protection, which is a comparable function. It's not the same product, but it's a comparable function to kind of say, okay, how do these margin products pay out over time, right? As you can see, we didn't have any payments since they came out, or since this chart goes back at least to 2020, 21, and 22. But then in 23, so you can see where this expected margin, the green line, and then where the blue line is the final margin, wherever that blue line is below the green line is where we're going to have a payment from the product. So in this just random sample county, they had a payment in 23, 24, and 25. Those payments approximately covered the premium and then a little bit more, but just to give you a big picture idea of how often have these things paid out in recent history. This chart doesn't give us a whole lot of information. It's kind of a lot of lines and it's kind of confusing as far as the what's on the lines, but the overarching theme is that when expected revenue is high, expected margin is also high, right? And when we have price declines or yield declines into harvest, that's where we see them get their payments triggered. Even though it's often pitched as this input protection tool, we'll get into this in a little bit, but the inputs are a pretty small piece of the pie. It's very much driven by the price and the yield, just like your regular revenue protection or the ECO and the SCO that we've taken in the past. This chart here is showing the nearby corn chart from 2020 all the way through 2026, so 6 years of data. What I tried to do with this box here is kind of show, okay, the gray is your typical February to October. Where does the price go from February when we get our spring price on crop insurance to October? The orange extension of that box is where does my price start here in August or September of the previous year versus where is it at in February versus where is it at harvest in October. So let's look at a year that did not have a payment. Let's look at 2022 as an example. So I'm going to roughly put this box on February of 2022. So in my rough drawing, this end of this box would be harvest of 2022. And then the orange would have been the price discovery period in August of 21 when margin protection was using the price discovery. So you can see there was no payment there because the price was lower in August or September. We popped up higher in the spring and then we fell off into harvest, but we were still higher than we were back here in this call it August of 2021. So what it would have taken, this county didn't have a yield loss, and so their price wasn't any lower, and so they didn't receive any payment on this product. If you fast forward and go, let's look at a year that does have a payment. Let's go to like 2023 as an example. So here's 22, here's 24. I'll just roughly put my lines here in the middle. Maybe shoot for right around here. So this is saying that the price in September, August or September of 2022 was higher. We came into the spring and it was still somewhat elevated, but then by harvest of 2023, we were significantly lower. And so that's why we saw a pretty decent margin protection payment in that year. The main theme, or what I'm trying to get at with this chart, is that when we're in big picture multi-year bull markets, and then we start to fall off of those and turn into longer term bear markets, these products that have an earlier price discovery period are going to perform better, right? Because you're able to take advantage of those higher markets in hindsight when they are higher versus falling lower. So that's just something to keep in mind from like a longer term price protection perspective. Do we like the sound of 490 because it's good relative to what we've seen, or is that truly a level that we want to start taking some risk off the table with an insurance product? I'm going to go a little deeper in the calculations just so you have a good understanding of how an MCO payment could come about. So I've got my color codings here. Gray is those values that are discovered in August 15th through September 14th of the following year. So August 15th of 2026. Green here are those values that we will discover in April of the planting. And then orange, the only thing we're discovering here in the orange is that October average for the fall price. And then of course the final county yield, which comes out later in June. So here in just about 10 days, they're going to start ticking along at that month-long average for diesel, DAP, urea, nat gas, and potash, and D's corn or November beans. Okay, then they'll come out with their expected final account or expected county yields, and that will give us the variables that we need to say, okay, I expect these values to be my costs. I expect these values to be my revenue. So at the market today, call it 490 is what we closed at today on the DC27 board. I'd have about $1,000 crop, $1,078 crop per acre out in that field. Let me slide over here. These are the per acre quantities that they are figuring for an acre. So in this county where we just used a 220 expected yield, they're figuring about 11 gallons of diesel per acre, 167 pounds of DAP, 253 pounds of urea, equivalent values, and then they calculate those by the futures values to get your per acre cost. So they're figuring all in for 2027 corn. In this county, I used Fremont County as an example. You're figuring $36 of diesel, $56 of DAP, $52 of urea, and so on down the line. Now, nat gas only comes into play if it's irrigated, so I'm just going to turn that off just to show you the math. They're figuring $168 for dryland corn. They're figuring $193 an acre for irrigated corn. And that's just all of your variable costs that they're using in their formula. These have nothing to do with what you actually use on the farm, what you actually apply for fertilizer, what you actually use for diesel. This is only what the general, the math that RMA came up with. Watson Associates is the name of the group that comes up with the program. They come up with to say, okay, this is roughly what an average variable cost is for this county. These charts over here are showing, this is just a breakdown of how much the inputs are worth in terms of the total. So obviously your fertilizers are your big ones, and then your energies make up about another third if it's irrigated. If it's non-irrigated, then it's a little bit lower. This is the more important chart that I would say though, because the point I want to get across here is you've got your price and your yield that are making up the revenue per acre. If you figure that you're roughly either side of break even in a given year, they're saying that $193 is all that's impacting this margin payment. And so that's less than 20% of the total compared to the price and the yield, right? So what I want to get across here is that your inputs are going to move the needle somewhat, but they're not going to move the needle as far as getting a payment on this product nearly as much as the price and the yield. A small change in price or a small change in yield is going to make a bigger difference than changes to the input side. And I can show you some examples here. So a lot of numbers here, but what I did is I essentially said, okay, what if I just took all of these inputs and they were 20% higher in the spring? So let's call it 1.2, 20% higher. Here's my indemnity box, no payment. What if they were 50% higher? Everything jumps because we have some kind of crazy war or something. That would never happen, right? If I had a 50% increase in my inputs, I'm getting about 80% of that payment, assuming the county yield and the price are the same. If my inputs doubled, then I'm getting all of that payment. But remember, this is only a 5% band, so this is only a $53 check at the end of the year on 100% payment. The one thing to keep in mind, let me bring this back to 1, so let's just say they're equal. Look at this matrix up here. This is saying that we've got roughly a price floor, call it between 450 and 470. Let's call it 460. It would be, if we used 490 times 0.95, 466 is where our trigger would be, our price trigger, assuming that the input stayed the same. If I dropped my inputs, let's say they just dropped 10%, so 0.9, Now my trigger comes down lower. So instead of having a 466 trigger, I'm going to have more like a 455 trigger, roughly. Okay. So that's one of the cons that we listed on this product is if inputs actually come down, you might not have as good of a trigger from a price perspective as you thought you did, because that's how it's geared. It's geared towards margin. They don't really care what the price was at the end of the day. They don't care what the inputs were. They care about what the price minus the inputs were, the revenue minus the inputs, to get that margin figure. So you can plug a lot of different scenarios into this, but just to give you an idea of, what kind of an increase does it take to trigger a payment, just assuming that price and yield are the same, it's about 32%. So a 32% increase in yield is going to start to trigger that payment. I'm going to get 15% of that, $50, so $7. Okay. One thing to keep in mind, we've been part of these products and why they've been so widely adopted is because of how subsidized they've been. So the MCO is going to be subsidized at that same 80% level as the SCO and the ECO were. The only one that's not subsidized at that level this year is the margin protection. So margin protection has retained that same 44% subsidy that it started out with. They just haven't been throwing subsidy dollars on it. I have to imagine that probably decreases the amount of people taking it, because it is a pretty expensive product. But just something to keep in mind as we're looking at options and making decisions. So back to the pros and cons again, just a refresher. We went through how it protects against a rise in inputs. On the flip side of that coin, a decrease in inputs could go against you. And then we talked about the calendar and how you have that earlier price discovery period. Bigger picture, and this is kind of my takeaway down on the bottom. If we like that 490, if let's say we stay in that 490 range on the DEES 27 board, and that's a level where we're comfortable with taking some risk off of the table from a price perspective, there could be a lot of merit to this product because we've got this 490 that we like, and we can lock that in ahead of the springtime. Who knows what happens between now and February? We could be much higher, we could be much lower, but it would be a way, excuse me, it would be a way for us to diversify some of those decision points. The other con, and just to review, is September 30th is that sign up. And once you're with that company on September 30th, you are with them through the end of next harvest until the 28 crop year. So definitely something you want to keep in mind if you, especially if we're in the camp of taking hail and wind products, that's going to lock you into that AIP before we really know what their wind products are offering for the year. So all good things to consider. If you have any questions for your farm specifically, give your broker or agent a call. We can walk through any of these scenarios with you and see if MCO is maybe something that you want to take this year. Obviously, we want to keep bringing you value in these videos and having some information available to you that is hopefully a little more specific to your operation than what you might typically find out there as far as just informational pieces. So give us a call if we can help at all. Thanks.